Are you carrying around unconscious traumas that could be limiting you? Keep watching. I'm Damon, this is Life Mastery Gym, and I teach people just like you cutting-edge NLP processes and techniques so that you can master your life and take charge of your destiny. So if that sounds good, make sure you click that subscribe button right down here so you can get these videos on a regular basis. I've been learning, teaching, and coaching NLP, Neuro-Linguistic Programming, for several years now. And along that time, I learned in my first time I took a master practitioner course in NLP, I learned re-imprinting. And right away, I realized that this was one of the most powerful things I had ever learned, one of the most powerful techniques that I had ever learned. And I really think that now, when I look at all the techniques that NLP has to offer, by far re-imprinting as a technique, as a NLP technique, has got to be the most powerful. Now, you've probably seen other videos where I talk about the most powerful model, and that would be the self-concept model by Steve Andreas, and that's the model that I really base all of my teaching, coaching, and all of my own personal work on. And re-imprinting and a lot of other NLP techniques fit very nicely into that model. So I just want to differentiate between a model and a technique. A technique is a particular technique or way of doing something, a process that you do for a specific reason. Now, a model is something much bigger. A model encompasses a lot of techniques. It encompasses a whole structure of how to do something. So the most powerful model, I would say, is Steve Andreas' self-concept model, and the most powerful technique in NLP, I would say, is re-imprinting. So by the end of this video, you're going to understand re-imprinting a lot better. Now, to really understand re-imprinting would be to actually see me do a demonstration and then to practice it yourself. It's hard to find people to do a demonstration with re-imprinting because it usually takes quite a while. Not always, but a lot of times it does take it's a long process, and it's usually very, very emotional because we're going to the core of a wound or a trauma and healing it. So it's hard to find people who are willing to do that on camera. If you want to see a video where I demonstrate re-imprinting, let me know in the comment section below, and if I can make that work, I will be happy to do that, and we'll see what happens. One of the best ways to explain re-imprinting is to also give you some examples of it. And there's a really wonderful one in a movie that you probably have seen. It's a movie that's been around for quite a while. It's called Good Will Hunting. Now, if you haven't seen it, I'm going to warn you right now, I'm going to spoil it for you. So you might want to stop this video and go watch that movie, or stop this video or skip past this part where I explain the re-imprinting that occurred at the end of Good Will Hunting. So if you have seen the movie, and even if you haven't, this will make sense. It's really the point at which we think Will Hunting, the protagonist played by Matt Damon, that he's pretty much made it. He's sorted his stuff out, and he's fine. He went through that hero's journey, but no, there's just something else that's left. He hasn't fully transformed. And Robin Williams, the actor who plays Will Hunting's therapist, knows that. He knows there's a little bit more. And so it's almost the last scene of the movie, and Will Hunting goes to him, and they're sort of doing their wrap-up, their last session, and everything seems great, but Robin Williams knows there's one more piece, and he tells Will Hunting, "It's not your fault." And Will Hunting kind of just goes, yeah, I know. And they're talking about Will Hunting's childhood, because he had a lot of abuse in his childhood, and that has left a wound inside of him where he has not been able to move beyond that limitation. So the wound has manifested in this limiting belief, this limitation. Even though he's extremely smart, he's a genius, he can't see beyond this limitation. And Robin Williams' character recognizes that that comes from this deep wound, this abuse that he felt inside. And Robin Williams also knows that he decided to take this on at a very young age. He decided that it was his fault that these bad things happened. And this is what we often do when we're very small, when we're children, and we receive some sort of trauma. When that happens, or some sort of abuse, we're also made to believe, and in some cases not made to believe, but we just take it on ourselves. We make a decision. We decide that somehow that was my fault and that was my burden to carry around. And so Robin Williams begins to press him gently and just says, "It's not your fault." And then Will Hunting just kind of backs up and he goes, "Okay." And Robin Williams continues. He just walks a little closer to him, looks him in the eyes and says, it's not your fault. And what he's doing is he's taking Will Hunting back in time. He's taking him back to the time of the trauma. But the difference is that Will Hunting is an adult, and Will Hunting has many resources as an adult that he didn't have as a child. And so he's bringing Will Hunting back in time to that time when he decided that this thing was his fault, and letting him know, it's not your fault. It's not your fault. And he finally starts to feel the pain resurfacing, and the wound is reaccessed. And Will Hunting starts to break down, and he starts to cry, and it becomes very, very emotional. And Robin Williams gives him a hug, and he cries it out. He experiences the wound, but he brings these new resources to it. Now that's a very quick version. I mean, it's a movie version, but it's a beautiful way to exemplify what re-imprinting is. Now there's more involved in the process, but I just thought in that movie they really capture it. So if you haven't seen that movie, go check it out. I know I just totally ruined it for you if you didn't see it, but it's what re-imprinting really is. So let's back up and let's explain the process, and I'll explain too when I use it. Now in a previous video where I talked about the most powerful word that we can use to get on the other side of a limitation. In that video, I mentioned that this is resistance. You know, we encounter resistance, and this one word that you can use, and I'll link that video to this one, that one word that you can use can get you on the other side of that resistance. And I often use it to speed things up when I'm coaching a client, or even for myself. I just say, okay, I use the what if frame, what if, and I go to the other side of that resistance, do the change, and then check in with myself. Am I now congruent with that? If I am, everything's great. And then sometimes the resistance is even deeper, and that's when a parts integration is really useful. And a parts integration is more in depth than just using the as if frame, but it's not as in depth as re-imprinting. So how would I know when to use re-imprinting? Well, it's when a parts integration isn't working either. It's when there's some really deep-rooted resistance that we're really struggling, as me being the coach and working with a client, we're really struggling to get to the core of what that resistance is and integrate it so that it's not a problem anymore, and that it also becomes a part of you, because we don't want to resist resistance. When there's resistance, we know that there's a part that's isolated, that's separated from the rest of you. And so I use re-imprinting really only when nothing else is working, when it's obvious that the resistance is very, very deep. And that usually indicates to me that there's a deep-rooted trauma and there's a wound, and we need to get to the heart of that and bring resources to it. So it'll show up as resistance, or it will show up as a limiting belief. And then I'll ask the person to access the feeling of that. So what does it feel like when you think about that resistance? Or what does it feel like when you think about that limiting belief? And it will manifest as a sensation in the body. And I'll tell the person to hold on to it, and then move backward in time. Hold the feeling and move backward in time and see how far back you can go to the origin of this feeling, this pain. And it's a little hard to do because it isn't so comfortable. It doesn't have to be super painful, but it's usually not that comfortable. So the person will hold that pain and slide back in time. And I'll say, slide back in time to the earliest memory that you have of this feeling, this sensation. And a lot of times they'll go back to early adulthood, depending on how old they are, or maybe even the teenage years. And then I'll say, okay, that might be the first time, but it might not be. Hold that feeling and see if you can go back even further. And most of the time, definitely the majority of the time, that feeling usually originates back from the ages between 0 and 7. And there's some research that suggests why that is, because we don't feel ourselves to be a fully formed person, a fully formed ego, a fully formed self-concept at that time. So once I bring the person back in time and we find that earliest memory, and usually it's not a memory that they remember, it's sort of a construct of something that happened. Most of the time they don't remember the actual details of the trauma, but that's okay, that doesn't really matter. And this often comes up as a question when we're doing a re-imprint. The person will say, did this actually happen, or am I just making this up? And it really doesn't matter. It's a manifestation. It's a structure that's manifested by the trauma, by the feelings. It doesn't matter if you have all the details correct. And that's how memory works anyway. Memory is reconstructive. We don't actually remember things exactly as they happen. Our minds sort of take a lot of liberties on how we remember something, and that's always based on the meaning that we create about it. Because you didn't have the resources, because you were too young, it left a trauma, it left a wound. And so what we're doing now is we're going to go back to that time and add in the missing resources. Maybe it's one resource, but a lot of times there's more than one resource. And fulfill that part of you and heal that part of you. Now, Robert Dilts made a contribution, an additional contribution to re-imprinting, and that is most of the time when there's a re-imprint, there was someone else involved, or there could have been multiple people involved. And a lot of times, not always, but a lot of times it has to do with a parent, because you were around your parents more and they were the authority figures around you. And there's also a lot of times re-imprints come about because of a feeling of loss of love, or that love was conditional, that you did something you weren't supposed to and your parents were punishing you for it or scolding you for it. And it was the first time you realized that, wait a minute, love might be able to be withdrawn from me, from my parents, or love might be conditional and I have to earn it back. So this happens often. It's not always what a re-imprint is, though. So the contribution that Robert Dilts made to this was not only to step back into yourself at that young age and find out what resources you need, but to also find out, well, who are the other people involved, or maybe it's just one other person, and associate into each one of them and feel what were the resources that were missing in them, that they were acting in this way. And this becomes very, very powerful. And the reason it becomes very, very powerful is because in our neurology, we're carrying all the people who we know, and especially the ones who mean a lot to us, like our parents. We're carrying them around in our neurology. And if you think about it, like even somebody who's passed on, if your mother or your father have passed on, but they maybe were responsible for creating such a trauma in you at a young age, you're still carrying them around with you in that memory. And so what we're doing is we're reuniting that part of you. It may seem like it's the other person, but we know it's not, because in your memory, other people aren't existing in your memory. You're recreating that in your neurology. Electrical impulses that are just recreating that sense of that other person. And chances are you feel very disconnected from that person. If they were doing something that caused you some sort of trauma or wound, you feel very disconnected. But you're not really disconnected from that person, you're actually disconnected from your own neurology. So we want to reunite these parts of you. And how we do that is by adding in the missing resources to everyone who is involved, not just you. And again, this becomes very healing and this becomes very powerful. And I'll give you some examples of it in a moment. So to be clear, the imprint is the trauma or the wound. The re-imprint is putting the resources in place to make you feel fulfilled at that moment and heal that wound. And once we do that, and we also add the resources in for the other people, and I do recommend doing it the way that the Dilts way, which is to basically re-imprint the other people, because really we're expanding the re-imprint beyond your sense of self to the other people who are involved, which again is still happening in your neurology. So we're reuniting all these parts. And then from here, with these new resources, we grow the person back up, we grow the client back up. And so they can sort of recode their life, knowing that they always had these resources, and get a sense of what your entire life is like, without the wound, without the limitation. Not to say that that didn't happen, not to say that the trauma didn't happen. It's to say, well, how would I have relived all this without carrying that limitation around? And then we get to the point of present day again, and you re-experience life now with these new resources, without the wound, like Will Hunting. He can go forward now after he's brought those resources and grown himself back up and reconnected the past to now, because that's a big part of it, is that disconnect from the past, of your past, especially that moment whenever the trauma happened, to right now. And we're fully connected again, have all of our resources, and then the only thing left to do at this point is then to future pace it. Without this wound, without this limitation, without this limiting belief, how do I now interact with the world around me? This was fundamental for me for overcoming self-worth issues. I carried around self-worth issues for a very long time, and it took multiple re-imprints and also a lot of work in my self-concept with the self-concept model to finally overcome that. Let me give you 2 examples of re-imprints that I did for other clients, and I will also tell you about the time that I went through my own first re-imprint. I was coaching someone who had a situation with his boss, and he was feeling very limited at his job. He loved his job, but he had an overbearing boss who was a bully, and he was finding it pretty much intolerable to work, even though his boss wasn't on his case all the time, sometimes, but not all the time. But he just found it intolerable to work with him. We tried parts integration, that didn't work, so I was pretty sure that there was an imprint here that needed to be re-imprinted. And sure enough, when we went back in time, he held the feeling. We went back in time to a time where he was about 6 or 7 years old, and he had been bullied by a neighborhood kid. And this neighborhood kid was his friend for the most part, as far as he knew. And then suddenly, out of nowhere, the neighborhood kid just grabbed him and started to choke him and made him say uncle or something like that to show submission. And he felt terrible about himself after this. He felt like it left a wound, and he went home and he told his father, and his father said okay and talked to the neighbors' kids, parents, and everything, but that never satisfied him. There was a wound left there. And so I said, okay, well, you know, what resources do you feel like you needed? And so we went through that. We found the resources, and I said, okay, well, you know what, you can access those resources right now. Go ahead and access those resources as that child who's being held and choked by this bully. And he did. And what happened was he stomped on the bully's foot, broke out of his hands, and pushed him away, and then went home. And that felt much, much better. And then I had him step into the bully and experience what the bully was feeling, and the bully needed basically the same resources that he needed, and it had a lot to do with attention and love that the bully wasn't getting from his parents. Now, we don't know if that's absolutely true, but that's the thing, it doesn't really matter for this to work. And so we grew him back up with those resources. He went back to work, and he felt completely changed, so much so that the bully boss actually took credit for it and was telling other people, because he had mutual coworkers who were coming back to him and saying, the boss says basically that he coached you into becoming a happier, better employee, when it was really the re-imprint. Another example of this is I was coaching someone, and at the time, this was a few years back, at the time he was 70 years old, and he could not travel anywhere by car and stop anywhere unless the stop was planned. And this was driving his wife crazy, because so if they were planning to take a 2-hour trip, maybe down the coast or something like that in California, because they were in California just like me, he would not stop unless before getting in the car they had planned to stop. So if his wife needed to go to the bathroom, or if even he needed to go to the bathroom, he wouldn't do it. And how this limited him was they could never take long trips together, because it's really hard on a long trip to plan every single stop, especially when you don't know that if you're going to have to go to the restroom or not. They couldn't really go anywhere. They were very limited by how far they could travel. And this was, like I said, driving his wife nuts. And he said, I don't know what this is about, but I've had it as far back as I can remember. I have to know ahead of time where we're going to stop, otherwise I will not stop. We held that feeling. We went back in time, and we went back and we went back, and it turned out that when he was a kid, about the age of 5 or 6, his father was a general in the military, and they were stationed in Germany right after World War II. And there was an American school where he would attend school, and where many of the other children of soldiers and generals of the U.S. military, their kids would go to this school. And the bus driver was also German and didn't speak very good English. So he was in the bus, and he was on his way home from school. And one by one, the bus driver was dropping off all the kids. So he started to look out the window, and he started to daydream, and time passed very quickly, and he lost track of time. And before he knew it, he looked back at the bus, and inside the bus, it was completely empty except for him and the bus driver. The bus driver apparently didn't know he was still there either. The bus driver probably thought he had gotten off the bus. And so he became very scared, and he felt very bad. He didn't know what was going on. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to get back to his home. So he walked up to the bus driver while the bus driver was driving, and when the bus driver saw him, he got very scared. And he didn't speak any English. And it became a very traumatic event for both of them, because this is right after World War II. There's still, Germany had just lost. And here's the son of a general, an American general. And so the bus driver's freaking out, the kid's freaking out, even more freaking out because the bus driver's freaking out. And so it became very obvious why he experienced a trauma in that moment. So we found the right resource. We brought that resource into him as a kid. It turned out that the bus driver actually needed the same resource because it was a resource that was able to overcome anxiety. So we re-imprinted him as a kid with the resource that would eliminate this anxiety. And we also had him associate into the bus driver and re-imprint the bus driver, which again is really him because it's happening in his neurology. And then we grew him back up. And this was, I think, the first time I'd ever done a re-imprint with a client. And I kind of forgot about it. And we did this over Skype. And then I was thinking, okay, well, we'll check back with him later and see if it worked. And I kind of forgot about it. He kind of forgot about it. And at the time, I had an NLP practice group. And sometimes he and his wife would show up to the NLP practice group. It was about a month later, holding the NLP practice group. He and his wife show up. Again, I don't know why, I completely had forgotten about this. And I said, oh, hey, how are you guys doing? And right away he said, I'm doing great, Damon. He said, I don't ever have to pre-plan stops now. I can drive as far as I want. And whenever my wife needs to go to the bathroom or needs to make a stop, it's no problem. And his wife was like, yeah, it's amazing. He's completely different. And it just blew my mind at realizing how powerful re-imprinting is, because when you alter behavior like that, when you change a limitation, you overcome a limitation like that, there's nothing that is more certain that something worked than that. So he was completely free of this. Now, again, he was 70 years old at the time. He had carried this around since he was a kid. And now for the first time at 70 years old, he was free of this limitation. The first time I experienced a re-imprint, I was attending a master practitioner training, and Robert Dilts and Judith Delosier were teaching it. And Robert had taught us how to do it. He had demonstrated a re-imprint, and then it was our turn to go out and do it. He told us to do this in pods of three people, and I volunteered to do the re-imprinting because I was dealing with a lot at the time. I was dealing with some huge limitations in my business and my personal life, feeling like I was very much restricted and not free in my life at all. And I wanted to get to the bottom of this. And when we did the re-imprint as a practice with the other two students, it didn't feel complete. It felt like there was something else, but it brought up a tremendous amount of pain and suffering, and I felt the wound very deeply. And what we got to was to the point where I felt that I could remember this situation with my father, where, and again, I don't know if this actually happened, but it felt like I had done something, didn't know what I had done wrong, and I was trying to run away from the situation. I knew my father was upset. I felt like he was angry, his anger was out of control, and I was running away from the situation because I was scared. And then I felt a hand on my shoulder, as if my father had put his hand on my shoulder and was holding me back. And that's about as far as we got with the practice session. And so I went to Robert and I said, Robert, I don't feel like this quite worked, and I'm not sure what's going on. And so he said, okay, we'll go back into the situation, associate back into when you're a kid. And he's like, well, what do you see? And I said, I see a hallway, and I'm trying to get away. I'm scared. My father's angry at me. It feels like he's out of control. And when I had associated into my father, I also felt that. I felt like he was scared because his own anger was out of control. And then he says, well, what do you feel? And I said, well, I feel a hand on my shoulder. So he went from the visual, what do you see? And then he went to the kinesthetic, what do you feel? Feel the hand on my shoulder. And he says, what do you hear? I thought for a moment, I said, I don't hear anything. He said, access the auditory, what do you hear? And as soon as he said that, I heard, you're not going anywhere. And it was a voice from behind me, the same voice attached to the hand that was stopping me. He said, you're not going anywhere. And he said, okay, now bring the resources in. and now what do you hear? And as soon as I brought the resources in, I heard my father say, you can go anywhere. And as soon as that happened, I felt his hand then push me, not in a bad way, but in a way of saying, you're released from this. You're released from this limitation. You're released from this trauma, this wound. It's now healed. Now you can go anywhere. It was extremely emotional, and I felt the wound heal right away. But in that process, it was a process of reconnecting with myself. So it was painful, but at the same time, very healing. And I felt complete and whole again. And I felt really like the limitation had come right off. Like what had been limiting me all my life up until that point was suddenly gone. And the changes that came after that were extraordinary. This was around the time that I started realizing what had been making me miserable in my marriage and my business and in my life in general, what had led me to the depressions I had experienced. And now finally that wound was healed, and now I really felt like I could go anywhere. And in that time, this was several years ago, this was probably 7 years ago, I truly feel like now, yes, I can indeed go anywhere, and my life has exemplified that, has resembled that ever since. Now you know a lot more about re-imprinting and how it works. If you want to take this deeper, if you want to start to learn this process, I highly recommend you start with Parts Integration. And if you look in the description below, you'll see that there's a link where I give you a breakdown of how to do a parts integration. So click that link, get your free access to that PDF. And that's a great place to start to learn this. It is a complex process. It does need to be taught in depth, demonstrated, and you do need to practice it. If you like this video, make sure you give it a thumbs up. And if you haven't yet, make sure you click that subscribe button and the bell so you'll be notified when I put new videos out, which is about usually every Wednesday and every Saturday. And last but not least, if you can think of a friend or a family member who would benefit from this video, make sure you share it with them. Take care.